Even as they are commenting on the politics of the present, sometimes they are framed within the context of older historical traditions and narratives and strategies of storytelling.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Nigerian modern art is having a moment. In London, the Tate has opened a critically acclaimed exhibition called Nigerian Modernism, featuring more than 50 artists who experimented with vibrant new styles in the mid-20th century in the giant and influential West African nation. In general, the artists of this era have become more recognized outside of their home country in recent decades. From early figures who laid the groundwork, like Aina Anabolu, to a towering figure of the 1950s, like Ben Nwanwu, to younger innovators of the 50s and 60s, such as Uche Okeke and Demas Nwoko, with many other important names to know and bodies of work to discover. This was an earth-shaking time in Nigerian history, when a near century of British colonial domination was shed and the many problems of a fragile new independent nation had to be faced. These artists were part of figuring out how to express that new sense of identity in images, but their art was not always so celebrated, sometimes dismissed as derivative of European art. Chika Okeke Agulu has been important to the recent re-estimation of Nigeria's art history. He teaches at Princeton and is the author, among many other things, of Post-Colonial Modernism, Art and Decolonization in the 20th Century Nigeria, a book that personally excited me very much when I first found it, I have to say. With the Tate show drawing a fresh wave of interest, I thought Okeke Agulu would be an excellent guide to what this art was, what it meant, and why it still demands attention today. Chika Okeke Agulu, you are on the short list, or have been on the short list, of guests I've wanted to have on the show for a long time, so I'm very excited to get the chance to talk to you today.
Same here.
I want to talk about your book, Post-Colonial Modernism, but before I talk about your scholarship, I want to mention your curating, because you begin the book talking about how you were kind of called into this field in 1992 with this unexpected project with an artist. So tell me about that.
Sure. In 1992, I was a junior lecturer in sculpture and advanced drawing at my alma mater, the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. And I had a teacher, and still today my mentor, an artist, Obiora Udechukwu, a poet of incredible power. He had called me in to ask if I might be interested in organizing an exhibition of Uche Okeke's work.
Right.
Now, Uche Okeke at the time was this legend, but he was going to be 60, right, the following year. And I hadn't met him before. He had left the University of Nigeria Nsukka before I was admitted as a student. But his shadow was all over the place, given his role in the story of modernism in Nigeria, but also especially the establishment of the Nsukka School there at the UNN, University of Nigeria Nsukka. So I was like, of course, yes. I hadn't curated an exhibition before. And so to be asked to curate an exhibition of an artist that I had never met, but who was such an influential figure in Nigeria at the time, was an opportunity I wasn't going to miss. And so I said yes, even though I wasn't sure what I was saying yes to in terms of, how do you put on a show? And I went on to organize the retrospective. Still remains the most comprehensive retrospective of Uche Okeke till today. That opened in 1993 at the Goethe Institute in Lagos. And so that was my initial foray into the history of modernism in Nigeria. And from then on, years later, when I left University of Nigeria Nsukka, and Nigeria was forced out of the system during the military dictatorship, that I had to leave the country. And so what was my option? The easiest one was to get a student visa to the US. I had friends who could help with that. And so what was I going to study? I already had my MFA and I wasn't going to do another MFA. So the closest thing to that was art history. Previously, I was a critic for several newspapers and magazines in Nigeria. So I was doing art criticism before then. And so I decided the most adjacent intellectual preoccupation would be art history. And so I applied to the University of South Florida to study an MA in art history. And then I picked up on where I stopped with the Uche Okeke exhibition, because there had been many questions about not just his own intellectual path and biography, but also the story of all these artists that I had seen in his diaries that he was talking about, and this thing called the Art Society. So the MA gave me the opportunity to begin the process of studying that history.
And that's the history that I want to dig into today. It's the history that's sort of having its moment now, well, in Europe and America at least. And before we get into the art history, I want to talk about the history, because one of the interventions of your book is to connect the art history to the politics and society of this very important time of the mid-20th century Nigeria, which, when you move from the period of British indirect rule, they call it British domination of Nigeria, to decolonization. So maybe just give a thumbnail sketch for the listeners of what's happening in the mid-20th century in Nigeria.
Sure. The British effectively annexed and ruled Nigeria as an empire from the very late 19th century through most of the first part of the 20th century. The amalgamation of the northern and southern regions that became Nigeria in 1914, all through that period, it was decades of struggle between the colonial regime and administration and the emerging intellectual elite in Nigeria who saw colonialism as antagonistic to modernity. And Olufemi Taiwo has published on this a book that's very fundamental to me. It's called How Colonialism Preempted Modernity. In other words, he uses the term socio-cryonics, that colonialism froze cultures and societies where they found them, rather than establish the infrastructure for modern state. Whether it's education, civil rights, capitalist market capitalism, and democratic dispensation. All of these elements of the modern state and society, colonialism was not in support of them, right? And so what you then had at the midpoint of the century during the decades of decolonization after World War II is an amped up process of decolonization. And so what artists and writers had to deal with in this moment was to ask themselves how they might participate in this decolonization process. The political decolonization, what about the cultural and artistic decolonization of colonial education? And that meant finding alternatives to the standard educational system that the British imposed, which, as they saw, was not sympathetic to their ambitions, right, for sovereignty, both political, cultural, and artistic sovereignty. And so that was where things were by mid-century. And so the artists that I was very much interested in were very much in the mix of this moment.
So yeah, formal decolonization happens in 1960. And one of the interventions of your book, or the provocations of your book really, is I think there is a kind of stock or pop post-colonial narrative that you get in a lot of things, that there's the organic, traditional Nigerian culture. And then there's outside traditions of autonomous art, like easel painting, for instance, that are imposed as cultural imperialism, for instance, on Nigeria. And it's not that you reverse that narrative, but you definitely think it's too simple. And in some ways, you do think that misses how the realities of what the educational system that Nigerian intellectuals were rebelling against in this time period actually was the actual conversation they were having.
You're absolutely right in reading what I was trying to do in post-colonial modernism. It's standard fare to hear stories about how Europe brought education. In other words, they brought modernity because they brought education. What I was asking is, what education did they bring? What brand of education did they bring? And that connects to Olufemi Taiwo's sociocryonics, that education was anything but sympathetic to intellectual sovereignty, intellectual progress of the colonized peoples.
Like they didn't actually want to teach them
Exactly.
for certain aspects of European history. Like I love that in your book where they say like, well, we maybe we want to Europeanize them, but we don't want to teach them about Oliver Cromwell. We don't want to teach them about
History was discouraged, for instance, right? Because that's what you learn, and then start making trouble when you know about history. And that's why dictatorial regimes frequently against the teaching of history, even in post-colonial conditions. And so that was the core of my problem, right, with the way that the history of art in Nigeria and many places on the continent were taught and told. In other words, that these early European teachers that had established some form of art training and so forth, that they brought modernity. In other words, they brought modern art. Actually, I say absolutely not. They were, in fact, against that, in the same way that indirect rule was against democratic dispensation. That's why they had to empower chiefs and kings and make up chiefs where they didn't have any as nodes of power, rather than encourage the rise and growth of civil society. Right. And so what I was arguing then is that it's not in colonial education that we should look for the source of modernity and modernism in Nigeria. Instead, it's in the early work of Nigerians and Africans that, went out on their own to learn forms of art that were alien to their tradition, such as easel painting or such as figurative naturalism, that these were modernist gestures in the same way that in Europe, you had their contemporaries. Aina Nabolu, the Nigerian, was a contemporary of Pablo Picasso,
right,
and Georges Braque, that were going in opposite directions. That in Europe, you had their avant-garde looking to new forms of image making and constructions of images, which they found in other cultures in Africa and Oceania and elsewhere. On the other hand, you had people like Aina Nabolu who were coming from these traditions that were not based on figurative naturalism, for whom newness and novelty was in figurative naturalism.
one of the provocations of your book is to challenge us to like see these Nigerian artists adopting European forms, not as them copying something or some kind of belated form of art, but as a provocation of the same order as Picasso looking to African sculpture for inspiration.
Precisely the reason why I would, out of perhaps generosity, hesitate to say that Picasso and Braque and Matisse were copying African sculptors, right? But instead, they were looking to them as sources of inspiration for inventing new forms and modalities, right, for the modern age, similar to what was happening on the African continent, where they were looking to figurative naturalism and photography Because I know Nabolu was an ardent follower of portrait photography as it was emerging at the time, because there was nothing, there was no basis for that kind of image making on the African continent. So photography and figurative naturalism were the ciphers of the new for artists that were coming from those traditions in Nigeria and elsewhere.
Yeah, Aina Onobulu, who you have talked about, is this, I guess you might call him the grandfather of Nigerian modernism, goes to England in 1920 to study, comes back, and is interesting to me that you frame him in tension with, he actually was part of bringing the first Western art teacher to Nigeria, this Brit, Kenneth Murray. And the interesting tension is that Kenneth Murray is like basically insisting that Nigerian artists not study European art, but focus specifically on traditional crafts. And it's Aina Onobulu who is saying, no, there's this other tradition. I want to claim that. And I think that's very interesting. Is that more or less his importance, you would say?
That's the tension that I was pointing to that complicated a rather simplistic view, right, of modernism and modernity in Africa, that he goes and brings this European teacher, but not realizing that the reason he was appointed, that is Kenneth Murray, was precisely because he had bought into the ideology of indirect rule, which was simply keep their old traditions because that's a site of their authenticity. To the extent that they align with us and our cultures and so forth, they lose their authenticity, right? And so that tension that began with Kenneth Murray's arrival and Onabolu's insistence on academic realism became for me the basis for articulating the project of modernism in Nigeria at that point. Because what then happens is that the next generation turned, in some senses, against that early Onabolu naturalistic realism that he brought. And that for me is a way of signaling that these artists were not mindlessly taking what was given to them, but instead had participated in a constructive discourse, right? They made clear choices in terms of how they wanted to relate with the past, the present, and the future.
That's sort of the prehistory. And Nigerian modernism really refers to, yes, the period of decolonization in the 50s and 60s. You conclude your book by calling it a short-lived, yet historically significant, complex, tangled, multi-layered, and fraught artistic modernism. How would you describe it as a style, as a time period? What are the characteristics of Nigerian modernism?
One of the things I did in the book is to, first of all, to say that this notion of avant-garde is not culturally specific, right? But instead that we can look at what is the primary condition for the avant-garde. And what I point to is three things. One is a desire to renegotiate one's relationship with the past. Two, an idea of progress. And three, intensive formal experimentation. Those three conditions you can apply to any avant-garde. And so when we look at what was happening in Nigeria and elsewhere on the continent during the mid-century, you have these three elements in play. And so with that, we would then say, how does that apply to Nigeria? And this is where I look to the work of the Art Society.
Right. This is the important part in the story. 1958, the founding of the Art Society Zaria.
Yes. Yeah. So with the founding of the Art Society, what you find is these young art students looking at these three elements that I've identified, right? What is their relationship with past artistic and cultural traditions? So this traditional African art, right, that someone like Kenneth Murray was promoting as inalienable to the modernist experience. In other words, for Africans to make sure that they continue with the arts of their ancestors. This was basically the Kenneth Murray model. The Art Society says, no, we're not here to continue, but we are here to negotiate our relationship with that tradition, but also the European tradition to which they were already introduced. In other words, they were claiming these two traditions, but at the same time to decide the terms of engagement, right, to that tradition. The same thing that you can say about the European avant-garde, right? They were rejecting earlier traditions, but they were not necessarily jettisoning them. They were renegotiating their relationship with that. The second part is, this notion of progress that was already written into the politics and ideologies of decolonization. This very idea of building a new nation that is different, better than what we had in the past. And one must never forget that this was what was happening in Europe at the time of the emergence of the avant-garde. The reshaping of nations and states and societies in Europe at the time. And then the third part is the intensive formal experimentation, which is connected to the decision they made on the first question in terms of traditions that they were playing with. And so this intensive formal experimentation meant studying specific artistic traditions and experimenting with them in order to come up with new forms.
Uche Okeke, the artist that we began with, that sort of began your journey into all this, he is one of the artists associated with the Art Society. And he has this concept that's very important to the concept of Nigerian modernism, which is natural synthesis. So what is his concept of natural synthesis? Why is it important?
Sure. So given what I have just described, how do you negotiate your relationship with the past and promulgate a studio process of intense experimentation in order to align with that first question? And so his theoretical proposition was what he called natural synthesis. In other words, and he had a poem that articulated this idea of natural synthesis, which talks about the contemporary person connecting with the art and practices of their ancestors, but also embracing the new, the modern. And that this process should be natural. It should not be artificial. This was his phrasing. Although I sort of step back and say, actually, it's not natural. It's actually a very vigorous intellectual process for you to think about what aspect of these elements do you synthesize.
This is where it's not about rejecting the Nigerian past either. It's just not in the cryonic sense, where the European art teachers sort of froze it in position. The importance is the active process of figuring out what in that is relevant to the present, correct?
Yeah, I was also mindful of the other history of European interpretation of African cultures and practices, which is to suggest that they were naturally disposed to creativity. In other words, they don't have to think, they just do it. They don't have to learn to dance, they are naturally disposed to dance.
You mean the stereotype?
Yes, that the stereotype of the African. And we saw that in earlier forms of modern artistic expressions. When you think about the work like Romain Defossé's work in the Congo, where the idea was that these Congolese did not need any form of education. Just give them paint and paper or canvas, and their natural instinct will eventuate into incredible pictures. This was the model of artistic training that you had prior to this moment. And so I was actually arguing against that, because the natural synthesis implied that form of, yes, it can come, naturally, this really vigorous experimental work. And so what I was arguing in the book is that it's anything but natural. This process of synthesizing what of ancestral traditions and what of European traditions do we bring together in order to form new aesthetics or artistic dispositions and elements that then would characterize the modernist work that we saw at mid-century.
And what does that work look like, if you could give some kind of idea?
Sure. So it depends on who you're looking at. They were not insisting that everybody must do the same kind of work, right? Like some of the avant-gardes that we've seen, earlier in the 20th century. What they did was to ask each individual to think of what aspect of their ancestral arts that they identify as important to them, and on the basis of which to conduct their formal experimentation. And so for someone like Uche Okeke, it was not sculpture, which is the classic African art, right, of the European avant-garde, but instead it's body drawing and mural painting among the Igbo, an art form called Uli that his mother practiced. And so it was in this art form that he identified crucial formal elements with which to engage in a modernist studio experimentation processes. At the same time, he was mindful of the work of the European avant-garde.
Yeah, he studied in Munich, right? He studied
That he studied in Munich, but even before then, in art school in Zaria. One of the things that they were doing in our society were to read about the European avant-garde and talk to each other about what they had read. So they introduced themselves to the work of the European avant-garde. And so that modernist sensibility that they identified with the European avant-garde was what they brought to bear in their process of experimenting with traditional Nigerian and African art forms. So for him, it was Uli. Demas Nwoko, it was knock terracotta.
In Uche Okeke's case, sometimes it goes back and forth between Nigerian myths and also sometimes very Christian, correct?
Yes, indeed. Because again, this is part of the synthesis that he was talking about, right? That the contemporary Nigerian artist has as much claim to Christian traditions as to their ancestral ritual traditions and folklore. And so we see in his work references to Christianity, to Old Testament histories of the creation of Adam and Eve and things like that. Because for him and for many Africans, that sounds very familiar to ancestral traditions and folklores about the primordial ancestors, right? Which, of course, that was what Adam and Eve represented in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so when you see them slip across Christian and traditional African histories and sources, it's in fact because they identify correspondences, right, in these histories and traditions and bring them together seamlessly. Although he was a Catholic Christian, he was also very much invested in the ritual traditions of his Nimo people at the same time, because that's the ultimate expression of this synthesis, right, that he was talking about.
And in either case, using these myths not just to reference religious tradition, but in your reading, as metaphors for the journey of post-colonialism.
Indeed, because how do you tell your story of the present if not by inserting it within older histories, older social, cultural narratives and stories? The same thing that societies have done all over the world. Why is it important for Euro-American societies to still connect to Greece and Rome, even if historically it makes not a lot of sense? But it's part of an insistence on a longer history, right? Which is the basis of nations and nationalism, as Benedict Anderson had informed us, this idea of constructing old histories, even for societies that didn't really have them. They make them up.
Imagine communities.
Yeah, they imagine old histories as a way to argue for the integrity of their claims to nationhood. And so we find similar gestures and tactics in the work of these artists, that even as they are commenting on the politics of the present, Sometimes they are framed within the context of older historical traditions and narratives and strategies of storytelling.
So it's a convention of a lot of art theory that the idea of the autonomous art object is a European invention and imposition in some cases. What I find so inspiring and provocative in your book is, yes, but it's also where in the colonial context that it finds its most revolutionary form, where the assertion of artistic autonomy, that I'm an independent artist, you basically find politics of this art of the early period of decolonization almost as much in that as the idea that assertion of artistic autonomy is a parallel for these artists to political autonomy and cultural autonomy, even if that is drawing on some European forms. I find that very fascinating. I guess my question for you is, how popular was this art? I mean, is it art of an educated elite? Certainly, that was something the colonial administrators threw back at them. Is like, you don't actually speak for the people. So, did it have an audience?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question and very important one at that, because it's often the case that once you are talking about an avant-garde, by implication, you're already talking about a network of agencies that are not connected, right, to the socials, right, to whatever their community is, because they are in advance, right, of that community. And that, you're right, was one of the accusations by the colonial regimes against the intellectual elite, that they were not naturally connected to their societies, and that was what informed their insistence on traditional rulers, right? As the ciphers
The
of
British, the
authority.
British.
Yes, the British, as the ciphers of authority in colonized territories. But what you then find in that history also is, and I tell a little bit of this in my book, is the decision by these intellectual elite to prove to the colonial regimes that in fact they were deeply connected to their societies. That was why they were the most ardent advocates for polygamy, for instance. In Lagos, they were the ones defending polygamy in the courts against the colonial
Interesting.
regime. They were the ones who set up town unions that then eventually became the basis for political parties in Nigeria. So Nnamdi Azikiwe, with all his education in the US and all of that, returns to Nigeria and sets up the Igbo State Union. The same thing with Obafemi Awolowo, who was highly educated. He was instrumental in the setting up of the Egbe Omo Oduduwa, the Yoruba ethnic socio-political formation. And the point was to prove to the colonial regime that they were not disconnected to their people, right? The same thing that you find in the art, that when you look at these artists that I was talking about in my book, but even in the way that their work was disseminated around 1960, they were commissioned to produce an exhibition for the independence celebration, the biggest fair in the history of Nigeria in 1960. Uche Okeke and Demas Muka and Bruce Anabrabaya were commissioned to create a pavilion for
The Art
art.
Society artists, yeah.
Yes. And so the work was seen by everyone who attended the Independence Fair in 1960. But also, it was the case that their colleagues in the media and in literature were promoting this work. There was a Nigerian Television Authority program that invited the artists to come, on TV and talk about their work. In addition to that, you also find that, as in the case of Uche Okeke, in his later career, he was instrumental in the Eastern region in setting up the Eastern Nigerian Festival of Arts, right? And so what you find is that as they were arguing for a space of autonomy as artists, they were also embedded in socio-political, right, frameworks that were emerging in this moment in Nigeria in the early 60s. And so when you think about the Mbari Ibadan or the Mbari Oshobo on the...
What is that? Just say
So
real
the
quick what that is.
Mbari clubs were set up by Uli Bayer, the German expatriate who was very instrumental in the development of African modern art and literature from 1950 onward, alongside some of the best known writers and artists of the period, Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Uche Okeke, Eskiam Fakhlele from South Africa, Ibrahim El Salahi from the Sudan, and so forth. So the Mbari was the convening of some of the most significant artists, writers, critics, and intellectuals of the period at Ibadan. And so through their work, and as I tell the story in my book, Mbari Ibadan was situated in the market. And anyone who knows about African markets, those are the public spheres of African societies, are the markets, right? And the Mbari Club was situated right in the center of the market, alongside a beer parlor, right? And so the work that they were doing in literature, the exhibitions, were visited by anyone who came to the market, right? So it was not the kind of experience that we know, right, of the European avant-garde that were completely distanced, except, of course, the Soviet, in the early phase of the Soviet artists that were trying to align their work with the revolution. But of course, that's why they were shunted off the modernist story, because they became too embedded, right, with the politics
the
of
politics
the
of the day.
revolution.
Speaking of which, as a parallel, and look, Nigeria is a hugely complex country, and the story of Nigerian modernism is hugely complex. We can only scratch the surface. People should read your book or the catalog for the Tate Show and so on. But there is a trajectory in Nigerian modernism that I do want to get to, because there's this optimistic period of the construction of this positive new national culture, kicking out the British. And then this sort of optimistic period does end. And in particular, the 1967 Nigerian Civil War is a big deal. Nigeria is a construction of the British. It brings together all these different cultures in one unit. And when it becomes a nation, there are all these tensions that climax. And that has cultural effects that are pretty important, and that the artists you've talked about already are engaged in working out those things. And it affects their art. So maybe just give a sense of the end of the story, or this chapter of the story of Nigerian modernism.
Sure. I indeed end my book in this moment, right, of the Civil War. And that's also because the Civil War marked the end of a dream, right? The end of a process. The decolonization happened. The progressive society that the partisans of decolonization, this progressive society that they imagined and desired, did not happen, right? And so the book, in other words, tells the story, how it started, how it ended, and the impact that that had on artistic production, discourse, and dissemination in Nigeria in this moment. And so what we find right after the political independence, Mbari Ibadan was the center of intellectual production, and Lagos, was where...
That's in the north?
No, Mbari Ibadan is in the southwest. So Ibadan is a few hundred miles northwest of Lagos, in the southwest. It was clustered around there. At the same time, in 1962-63, Mbari Enugu was formed in the east, where Uche Okeke comes from, with other Igbo members of the Art Society. So in other words, they moved from Lagos-Ibadan axis to Enugu. And that already anticipated the breaking up of the national imaginary, right? And so as the nation was fragmenting politically, artistically, and culturally, it was also doing the same. That increasingly, these artists focused on their own region. Through Mbari Enugu, Uche Okeke set up his cultural center also in Enugu, that then captured art and cultural production there. We also see in the subject matter of the work, and that's how I end the book, looking specifically at the work of Demas Nwoko and Uche Okeke himself, in the sense that the subject of their work began to reflect this fragmentation of the nation, beginning with the first military coup in 1966, the arrival of the soldiers, and then the mass killings, the pogroms of Igbo people in the north, and the eventual civil war. And so the end of this story, right, the political story, is also the end of modernism as a chronological phenomenon. Because what then happens is that all of that ambition to create what Frantz Fanon in 1958 had called national culture ended with the war. From beyond the war, there were very few artists that were talking about national culture. Instead, what then happens with a contemporary art that came after was an art that was more or less critical of the nation because of the problems that had emerged, right, in the political promulgation of the new nation. With all the military coups, the civil wars, the economic downfall of many of these societies, contemporary art renegotiated its relationship with the idea of the nation. And that's really how I end the book.
It's a tragic story. It does produce some art that's very moving or affecting. Is there a work that sticks in your head?
Obiora Udechukwu's Blue Figures is very important because it's work that he made during the Civil War. I also think of, since we've been discussing the Art Society, Uche Okeke's About Women's War from 1965, or Demas Nwoko's Soldier. These are works of incredible power, visually, formally speaking, but in the way that they speak to the historical experience of Nigeria in that moment, captures, as any creative meditation might, not just where they had come artistically in terms of this question of natural synthesis and how that helped them invent new formal modalities, but also in the way that they had begun to diagnose the problem with the nation. And so, if I must end with the About Women's War, was about an event that is Uche Okeke's painting, that an event that took place in 1929 when Igbo women engaged in really serious, if you might, violent resistance of the colonial regime in eastern Nigeria. Why Uche Okeke will return to this subject in 1965 is really what I find very important, because for him to recall this moment of revolutionary action by Igbo women against the colonial regime to what was happening to Nigeria in that moment of political and national fragmentation. And so that one work, I think, signifies all of the journeys, right, I was describing in the book from the early 20th century to the ending point of the mid-century.
Well, there's no way to do justice to all this history in a 40-minute podcast. I only hope that we can excite people about it or get people engaged with it. Chika Okeke Egulu, thank you so much for your generous time.
Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate doing this with you.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review The Art Angle. It helps other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili, with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.